Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through the industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Dan Bredeson, an organizational culture and leadership consultant with over 20 years of experience. He's the author of the Amazon bestseller, Seeds of Culture. He has held leadership positions with Fortune 500 companies and several non-profit organizations. Welcome to the show, Dan.
AJ, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome to the show. You are welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people will benefit from what we'll be talking about. We'll talk about organizational culture. A lot of companies all across the world, are there, but all of them will certainly need to know more about organizational culture. So first, to understand from you itself, in the backdrop of itself, which will give a good perspective on this, is about the Great Resignation itself. So what was the reason for Great Resignation? Obviously, it will reflect a bit about on the understanding of organizational culture. We know about the Great Resignation. Many people talk about the reasons for it, but you are the expert, Dan. You are the master. So we would like to know from you, what was the reason for the Great Resignation?
It's I got a couple of ideas on that, and I've often said that my book would have come out about 6 months sooner, because I was finishing it up around 2021, 2022, and as I was finishing up the manuscript, I say, "Wow, we're in the middle of this thing that is taking up an awful lot of column inches, an awful lot of airtime on news. This is not." Everyone's posting on their LinkedIn and YouTube and everywhere else about this thing called the Great Resignation. I can't really write a book about culture and not talk about the Great Resignation. So it took me a few months of doing some research on a very hot topic, a very new topic, trying to find some foundational information on the Great Resignation and the reasons for it. It was not isolated just to the United States. In 2021, Microsoft actually came out with a global survey saying that 41% of people employed across the globe were considering quitting their job. So a lot of the statistics come from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, but it was not isolated just to North America or the United States. But it got an awful lot of traction here in the US because the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been keeping track of the number of people quitting their job for 23 years now, since about 2000, 2001. And in America, in any given month, no more than 4 million people had ever quit their job. So people have been quitting their jobs since there's been jobs to quit, but there'd never been a single month with over 4 million people quitting until we start getting into 2021, mid 2021 into 2022. And for 9 out of 10 consecutive months, more than 4 million people decided to say, I'm done and I'm out. And it created an awful lot of a vacuum within the workforce, and companies were left scrambling, and sometimes they were left, trying to have bonuses to get people to come back to work. And it was a big mess. It was a big mess. So I took a look at it, and I started looking at some of the Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and I came up with basically two ideas. The first of which being, so we're talking about the Great Resignation, right? And isn't it kind of funny how a lot of historical events start with the word "great," right?
Absolutely.
The Great Depression, the Great Recession, in the States here, the Great Chicago Fire. A lot of times those great historical events are just unmitigated disasters. But the Great Resignation was a little bit different because it seemed to be a good thing for employees who were finally taking the reins on their professional career path. So the two things I landed upon for the Great Resignation, I call the first one, which is, it's just the Great Correction. There were a lot of economic factors that led to the Great Resignation. And really, it's just a correction in the labor market. When COVID-19 started to shut down the world, employers had to keep their employees out. They had to temporarily shutter their doors. They had to lay people off. Unemployment spiked, right? Well, as the world started to open back up, the labor market started to correct itself, and when vaccines were distributed and when restrictions were lifted, people looked around and they said, wow, I've been waiting a year to quit this job, right? And now the economy started to pick back up, and quite frankly, the number of resignations in any particular economy, it's a pro-cyclical economic event, meaning that if if the economy is going well, you're more confident that if you quit your job, you can go find another one. If the economy is in the dumps, you're not as likely to quit a decent job that you have now to go try and find a better one. So the first reason for the Great Resignation would really be an economic one, meaning that the economy started to pick back up. People were like, hey, the job market was red hot. So people said, hey, I've been stuck in this job. I want to get out there and quit. So really, the first thing is economic. The labor market corrected itself. But let's not forget the second reason for the Great Resignation, and I call that the Great Epiphany. While their jobs went remote and they were stuck at home, doing their work, probably sitting next to their kids who are getting, virtual schooled at home, they started to think about, what is it that I like about my job? What's really important to me? Where do I want to spend the next 40 hours a week or more for the next 30 years of my life? And they kind of had an epiphany about what's really important to them, and also came to the realization that there's really two things that drive your happiness at work. One is going to be the actual work itself. What's the bare bones of the work that you're doing? And the second thing is going to be the interactions with your fellow employees. And when you were showing up to an office, you had interactions. You'd go to lunch, you'd go to a happy hour, you could walk into someone's office and have a conversation. When that was absent, when the world went remote, you're going to be left with the bare bones of your work. And sometimes people were consider their job to be a good job because they liked their coworkers more than the actual work. Well, now that their coworkers were taken away, they had to have this, had to have a sit down with themselves and say, is this really the work that I want to be doing? So the Great Resignation's in two parts. There are two parts to the story, the economic one and the emotional one. Labor market corrected itself, people having an epiphany about what's really important to them. And when they had this epiphany in the middle of a red hot job market, they were able to go and find work elsewhere.
Right. How do we look at organizational culture here? A lot of people said, I don't have work-life balance. And because of that, I will go to other jobs or other way of life, which gives me that flexibility. As you said, it's the emotional reasons. Why is it that, that in the same breath, when we talk about Great Resignation, people were talking about organizational culture as well as toxic work culture in several places. So I want to understand from you, how do you look at in that aspect in terms of organizational culture? Did organizational culture, workplace culture aided or put fire to, help in putting this,
did it help light the fire, or was it the match that struck the gasoline that,
so
this Great Resignation?
I want to understand in that aspect, because this had been building for quite some time, and this led to quite quitting. And this is still going on as companies try to say, listen, earlier on, we could not predict that this whole COVID thing or work from home will be forever. So you come to office at least thrice a week.
Right.
And so that is where, why can't these people just be straightforward? Why can't such great minds get some things right and convey all these things to the employees properly, the factual positions here? In that backdrop, I want to understand the organizational culture. However nicely we want to put our companies in, the fact is that the buck stops with the leaders.
Yes, you said a lot there now, and remind me to come back to quiet quitting, because that does play a factor into it. So I'll go with what the research shows. MIT did a study, and they released in 2020. They came out with their list of what they call culture champions, and they had done surveys and looked at millions of online posts of how people talk about the place where they work and whether or not they like it. And they had come up with this list of what's called culture champions. Okay. And these were companies that, by various, however you would measure it, however many metrics, the different metrics that you would have over culture, were culturally winning. I mean, they were also winning in performance as well. The people who were on the companies, the organizations that were on MIT's list of culture champions, publicly traded companies that were on the list of culture champions, their stock was outperforming the S&P 500 index by 4 times. It was producing NASDAQ by 2 times. So they're winning culturally, and they're also winning financially. So what was found in that study, what MIT found, is that a culture was the number one, and specifically a toxic culture was the number one driver of the Great Resignation in the first 6 months of the Great Resignation. Now, in years gone by, it was always figured that people were going to quit their job so they could just go make more money. Getting a better job was always kind of defined as getting a job that paid you more. Interestingly enough, is that on the list of culture champions that MIT put together, toxic culture was number 1 on that list in terms of quitting. Compensation was number 16. It was 16th down the list. So just paying people more and trying to throw more money at the problem isn't going to do any. In fact, culture was 10 times more likely to be a predictor of resignations in the first 6 months of the Great Resignation than compensation. So really, culture matters. And going to one thing that came up was technology, because the ability to work remotely now. You have to think, before 2019, 2020, what percentage of the world was working remotely or even had the technology to do it? The technology was forced upon us, right, when we were sent home to work. And now that we got kind of used to it, we got more of our time back. I was not working remotely at the time, but my wife was, and I just remember her just saying, "I got so much more of my life back. I don't have the 45-minute commute each direction. This is kind of nice." Where it was initially sort of weird to be working from home, it eventually became very nice, and that's why a lot of people quit when there was a hot job market. Now, let's go to quiet quitting for a second. At least in the States, the job market has cooled. So people aren't able to quit. So what they're doing is they're quietly quitting, meaning that they're doing just enough to not get fired. Now, I would argue that, and I'm sure there's going to be more research done on quiet quitting in the next coming years, but I would argue that quiet quitting's always been around. Right. Well, in the organizations that I led, I knew there was a certain percentage of people who were doing just enough to not get fired. We just didn't have a fancy term for it. What I think it comes back to would be, if someone's just doing the bare minimum in order to not get fired, they don't have a true commitment to the organization. In the research that I did, I actually, in the book Seeds of Culture that I wrote, one of the ways that we can cultivate the seeds of culture is through this 4CP life cycle of performance. That's what I call it. Every organization is looking to perform. I don't care what you're doing. You could be selling things. It could be a nonprofit, and it's the amount of good that you can put out in the world. Whatever it is, every organization's got to perform. And in order to get that performance, it starts with the culture, and then that leads to the climate of the organization. And I can define those if you want. The third kind of spoke on that wheel is commitment, meaning that I'm going to decide that I'm going to commit to this organization and give it my all. If there's enough individuals that have put in that commitment, they're going to create a community. And if you've got a community of like-minded individuals who are committed to the organization and to each other, that is going to spur your performance. And that's going to have a culture of performance, a culture of commitment, and round and round and round we go. The type of commitment that is, and organizational commitment actually comes down to 3 different things. And without getting too textbooky on you here, there's 3 different types of commitment that a person can make to an organization. The first one's called effective commitment, meaning that I'm showing up, I wake up in the morning and I run to work because I want to be there. I believe in this organization's mission. I am going to work hard in order to do everything that I can to help propel this organization's mission forward. That's called effective commitment. The second kind of commitment is called continuous commitment, meaning that I show up to work here because I have to. I got kids in college, I got bills to pay, I got a mortgage, I have to keep showing up here, not because I want to, but because I have to. They pay me well, and I want to continue the type of lifestyle that I've had. That's continuous commitment. The third kind is what's called normative commitment, meaning that I show up because I feel obligated to. And you'll often see this in organizations if an individual say, and I've done this myself in the past, where maybe I took a chance on someone, maybe someone who didn't quite fit the mold, but I had a good feeling about them. I took a chance on them. They felt grateful for that opportunity. Now I was not doing this on purpose, but I've had people tell me like, Dan, I feel like I need to keep showing up to work because you took a chance on me. I feel obligated to do my best for you because you did something for me when no one else would. We have to think about those three, right? Showing up because you want to, showing up because you have to, or showing up because you feel obligated to. So many of the compensation practices and the management practices that businesses have really try to leverage that continuous commitment. I'm going to pay you more. I'm going to give you more benefits. I'm going to have vesting when it comes to things like retirement or pension plans. It's constantly trying to feed this continuous commitment. When in reality, effective commitment actually drives the best performance. When people are showing up because they want to, not because they have to, that's going to lead to a higher level of performance. So perhaps some of the quiet quitting that's going on is because people are doing just enough to not get fired because they need to have that continuous commitment fed, versus being part of an organization that they want to show up to each and every day. Get up out of bed and run to work every day.
Right, right. In terms of organization, this is almost like a shift in the way things have been. And post-COVID, it's a new world altogether. People are trying to, as you said, quite quitting, whether we call it a fancy name, but the fact is that it is there. And that is where now another term has come that is called quiet firing. So let's see what happens as this goes. But in terms of, there was a lot of questions that were raised on the type of leadership that organizations had. And people were almost saying it is leadership in crisis. And in some places, people start, and even today, nowadays, I read about automating the role of the CEO. In fact, one CEO role was automated. I guess it was some Hong Kong company, and that was doing better than what the human CEOs were
they
doing.
They had AI CEO. Is that it? They had,
almost like all
got Chat GPT running the business.
Right, almost like that. You got to. If I'll share that link with you. And I did not follow it after that, but the last was that it was doing quite well. The parameters were, met much more better than a human CEO. So looking at that aspect, a lot of employees or workplaces seem to be asking questions of the leadership. How do you see organizational culture in that? Is it unreal? Is it that employees are having unreal expectations of workplaces? Is it that there is indeed a problem with workplace culture? That's why you are talking about seeds of culture. Also, you also talk about failing organizations, that how organizations fail, and then they try to bring in a new leader, and again they try to write a new script, and then there is this cycle keeps on going. So let's look at the realistic way things are and tell us what this organizational culture is all about. How do I know whether the culture of an organization is good enough for me or good enough only for them? And then I take my call according to that. How does this tell also about how our corporate culture is moving forward? Is it the right way to look at a long-term job prospect for myself, or should I start with entrepreneurship or freelance work from the very beginning itself?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So a lot to unpack there too. So we've talked about culture a lot, and I'll go ahead and define the word, that because culture may mean different things to different people. And that was one of the first things that I did, is defining, what is culture? It's only 7 letters long, but it packs a big punch. Culture could be dealing with a whole bunch of different things. The best and most succinct definition of culture that I've been able to come up with, and I love it so much, I wish I would have invented it, but I didn't. Deal and Kennedy, a couple of culture consultants back in the 80s, came up with it. Think about this. The culture of an organization is, simply put, how we do things around here. Okay, now that may seem like an oversimplification, but if you really think about it, when you go into a new organization and you have like your new hire orientation, they're telling you what we do around here. These are the processes, these are the products, this is how we do what we do. I'm sorry, this is what we do, right? This is what we do. But how we do it and how we interact with our fellow organizational members, you won't know that until you leave the walls of that new hire orientation and you spend every day out there finding out, so how is it that we communicate with our coworkers? How is it that we communicate with customers? How do we dress? How do we walk? How do we talk? How does this organization discipline? How does this organization celebrate? It's all of the things, how we do things around here. And it's all of the things, how we hire, how we fire, how we communicate. That's going to determine an organization's culture. How we do things around here is then going to determine how we feel about the way that we do things around here. And that's actually the climate. When someone is, sitting around the kitchen table talking about their day, or they're out to dinner with some friends and they're talking about their day, good or bad, they're talking about the climate of the organization. The way that things are done is going to determine how people feel about the way that things are done. And then that's ultimately going to feed into their commitment and do they have a community. So culture is important because culture drives an awful lot of performance. And that's how we define the culture. One thing that I noticed in all the different organizations that I've done is I've had hundreds of different clients. I've conducted, in my estimation, about 7,000 interviews with people looking to find different jobs. And in the course of those 7,000 interviews that I've done, if I scan a resume and I ask the simple question of, so of all the jobs listed on your resume, which was your favorite and why? Right? And then listen to what they say. And then watching the leaders of all of the different organizations that I've worked with, I've noticed some common themes. There's a bit of a debate about, does leadership impact culture or does culture impact leadership? Now, I would argue that it is kind of a two-way street, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be weighted more in favor of the leader helps grow the culture, right? So the reason why I wrote Seeds of Culture and the thesis within that is what I noticed throughout my years of working with lots of different companies is that the leaders who were winning financially, performance-wise, and had a great culture, right, determined by how we do things around here, they had some common characteristics, right? And I outline them in the first part of the book. They had some common characteristics, but the biggest one would be that they reminded me more of a farmer than they did a carpenter. What I mean by that is I grew up on a farm. So, the book's written from my professional experience with academic research. And then I look at it through the lens of my time growing up on a farm in order to come up with like a different paradigm for the way leaders should be interacting with their organizations to grow a culture of commitment. And at the end of the day, think like a farmer, don't think like a carpenter. Carpenters try to build things, right? You often hear culture referred to in construction terms, like we need to lay a solid foundation for culture. We need to build culture. We need to transform culture. A lot of times if an organization fails, because you mentioned failing organizations, if an organization fails, what typically happens? Well, let's bring in a new leader. And one of the first things that new leader says is, I need to transform the culture around here. And they're given the honeymoon period that every new leader has, and there's a general sense of morale that picks up for a while. But if the leader's not actually growing the culture organically, eventually people are just going to go back to doing what they've always done, which is underperforming. And then guess what happens? Oh, let's bring in a new leader. Now the new leader comes in and says, oh no, we need to transform the organization. We need to have a cultural transformation. It's taking a line from Seinfeld, George Costanza, a character on Seinfeld. I call it the George Costanza method of organizational change, meaning that just do the opposite of whatever the previous leader did. If you remember that episode where George goes about his day and like every decision that he's ever made has always been wrong. So Jerry recommends, well, if every decision you've always made has been wrong, doing the opposite must be right. So a lot of times leaders will come in and they're like, just do the opposite of what the previous leader did. Now, sometimes that works, but it's not, I would say it's the exception, not the rule. If a leader can think about culture as an organic process, not a construction zone, they're going to plant the right seeds of culture, cultivate that performance, and that's going to grow and have the patience of a farmer grow a culture of commitment. That's the thesis of the book.
Right. So Dan, you talk about, think like a farmer, not a carpenter. organizational culture is grown, not built. So
Mhm.
who builds this? Who grows this organizational culture when the leadership itself is very much always in transition? What is the life of a CEO in an organization? 2 years, 3 years, anything after that is a bonus. So
Right.
will the CEO be in a position to grow, or will the CEO will always look at, like almost like a 3D printing, bring something from somewhere, try to build something fast and show it
Right.
to the world that, listen, I have been successful in doing something. So help us understand then, whose responsibility is this organizational culture? A CEO may maximum they can just sow in some seeds of culture, but who
Right.
does actually take care of the culture itself?
The organizational members, I was having a conversation with a group just a couple of days ago, and having the conversation around how organizational members, one of the seeds of culture is getting to a place of called mutual accountability, meaning that I will, if we can plant the seeds properly, there's the hybrid seed of culture. These things will work together to create mutual accountability, meaning that we will work together to protect that culture without having a leader do it. And you see this often because there's culture and then there's also subcultures, and you're probably familiar with this. You have a large organization, but then individual business units kind of have they got their own flavor, they got their own flair. The sales is a little different than IT. Maybe sales is a lot different than IT, but there's different organizations will have their own what's called subculture. And from a performance standpoint, the subculture that you exist in actually has a greater impact on your individual performance than the larger corporate culture. And if you think about it, it's one thing for the CEO to make grandiose statements and go on Bloomberg and talk about shareholder value and this, that, and the other. That's one thing. And maybe the CEO is awesome. Maybe she's great. Okay. But at the end of the day, if you've got a really bad manager that you have to report to every day and has a really bad subculture that you exist in, you're going to be miserable. Also, the flip side of that coin is, let's say that the CEO or senior executives are like really bad and toxic and negative. If you've got a great leader or someone that you directly report to that can help buffer some of that toxicity away from the culture that you've created, that can be a good thing. So to answer your question is that if a leader comes in and plants the seeds of culture, eventually moving to a place, what I call a mutual accountability, where the organization's getting each other's back, right? Without having to raise their hand or send an email to HR or talk to some supervisor about, I don't like the way that this person is doing things. If they can police themselves, for lack of a better word, that's going to be a long-term, sustainable culture. Now, a new leader may come in and that new leader may be toxic. Right? Let's say that there's a great culture that's built. Well, then we have to remember the value and the benefit of having subcultures that will stay strong, even if the toxic leader happens to be toxic. And then you just got to wait that person out, because they'll eventually fail. So from my
Again, you
experience
see,
anyways.
right, you see organizational culture, then subculture. So I'm trying to understand, especially for, say, a startup point of view, who are trying to scale up, how should they build this culture from the very beginning? And how do you start building the subculture also? Because employees, mostly in a close-knit environment, they would rather more relate with the subculture and not the organizational culture, which is on a wider umbrella. How does that work? Does your book answer that? Seeds of
Yes, it
culture.
does.
Who is this book for? Is it for employees? Is it for the leaders? Is it for the founders? Is it for the board members?
Sure. I would say that anyone that has any kind of leadership influence in an organization will find great value in this. I wrote it with leaders in mind, just being real candid. Like, I wrote it with leaders in mind about how they can become culture farmers. What I found since its release is I'm getting a lot of feedback from folks who aren't leaders yet, but would like to become leaders, and a smaller subset of people who aren't leaders, don't really want to be leaders, but they want to be able to understand this culture thing. Culture is like a buzzword that is out there. It's like it's like HR and M&A and then IT and DEI, and like, it's almost, culture is almost a buzzword at the place where they work, and they want to understand what is it that people are talking about when it comes to culture. So it's yes, there is research in the book, but people have shared with me that it's still very conversational and very accessible to everyone. So I hit a sweet spot there, apparently, with writing something that is well researched, but also accessible to individuals. So individuals who want to move into a position of influence. Let's go back, because you brought this up a couple times. What about startups? What am I an entrepreneur? Well, every entrepreneur that I've ever run into doesn't want to be a solopreneur, right? They eventually want to scale themselves. They eventually want to have one person, one becomes two, two becomes four, four becomes eight, and so on and so forth. The advice that I would give to them is actually, it's actually one of the attributes of successful culture farmers would be, make sure that you understand that to make culture a priority. Understand what it is, understand what the definition of it is, which is how we do things around here. If you're a solopreneur and it's just you, but you eventually want to scale, make sure that you are communicating to the people who come on board clearly, this is how we do things around here. Have that defined in your own head. What do I want this to look like? How will I plant these seeds once I have more people coming on board? Now, I think what you might find is that if you plant the seeds properly, you're going to have other people coming to your cause because they want to be a part of a good culture. As I said, culture is 10 times more likely, is 10 times more important to a person than their compensation. People will actually take a pay cut to work at a place that has a better culture. And that's one of the byproducts of COVID-19 and the Great Resignation. So be intentional, make culture a priority, understand what it is, understand what it isn't, and follow the 6 traits of successful culture farmers that I lay out in the first part of the book.
Right, right. One last question I want to understand for the audience, Dan, is that how is this, culture changing? Now we have the new generation coming up, and they are taking up a lot of spaces in all areas of our lives, and they think totally very differently than what we are, and even the present generation of leaders will have to give way to the new generation. How do you think is, in the backdrop of either Great Resignation, in the backdrop of what the Generation Z wants, in the backdrop of how businesses are changing, in the backdrop of new technologies coming in the backdrop of Chat GPT, how will organizational culture change? What do you look for? When you look into the future?
If I'm going to pull out my culture crystal ball and look into that, I would first say that I think we can learn something from the past before talking about the future. One thing of doing the research for the book is I came to, during the Great Resignation, I got tired of people saying over and over again, now more than ever, culture matters. Oh, so many people are quitting. Culture matters now more than ever, now more than ever, now more than ever. It's almost like, we had to get used to that and like the new normal with COVID-19, right? Well, here's the new normal. Both of those were just repeated ad nauseum. And I got to thinking about it. Really, is it culture now more important than it has been before? And the answer, I believe, is no. If we can look at our history, back in the Industrial Revolution, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the labor wars that were going on, people were pulling out guns and fighting against one another in order to improve the culture of the organization where they worked, and meaning that how we do things around here. Are we going to work the 14-hour days for no pay and owe our soul to the company store? Culture has been important for, I think, forever. Culture was important 100 years ago. It's going to be important 100 years from now. And with the right type of culture, when we're talking about different generations, from millennial to Generation Z, whatever you want to call it, I still believe there's a fundamental thing inside of all of us that we want to feel as though we're part of a community. We want to feel as though we're part of a community by planting the right seeds of culture, creating the right type of climate through managerial practices. It's going to engender an organizational commitment within individuals. If you get enough individuals committing to the organization as members of a community will perform together because they feel like they're in it together. And that's definitely something that is stronger. I don't know if it's stronger in millennials and Generation Z. Perhaps it is, but I think there's a lot of runway that we can run here for creating the type of, for growing the type of cultures that lead to commitment, that lead to a sense of community, that's going to lead to performance. And then it's a big feedback loop. So I think we can learn a little bit by looking to our past to determine our future, and also understanding that at the end of the day, people want to go to work to a place where they feel like they're involved in something bigger than themselves. And that is a sense of community. That's my
Wonderful.
answer.
Wonderful. You have summed it quite well. So there is much to learn about culture as things are so dynamic all the time. And so organizations who want to understand more about culture, startups who want to, uh, plant the seeds of culture, what is the best way for them to learn from you and for also to engage with you professionally?
Sure. There's the book, Seeds of Culture. My name's at the bottom of the screen there. You can just go to danbredeson.com. That you can reach out to me there. You can drop me my contact information there. I'm on Instagram, Dan Bredeson Author. Facebook, Dan Bredeson as well. That's the best way that my social channels that they can reach out to me. But yeah, you go to danbredeson.com. It's got some information on the book, and then you can hit me up at the contact at the bottom. Be more than happy to talk to you.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
AJ was awesome. Thanks for having me.